This is the night mail crossing the border, bringing the check and the postal order, letters for the rich, letters for the poor, the shop at the corner and the girl next door, pulling up, beat took a steady climb, the gradient's against her, but she's on time.
From the pages of the modernization plan, the new outlines are emerging and becoming reality all over the country. This long rail welding depot at Dinsdale is
British railways are the busiest in the world, and yet they lose enough money to put something like 9p on the income tax. Now, the British Railways Board, under the chairmanship of Dr. Richard Beeching, have completed the investigations they were asked to make and published their proposals.
We found ourselves some 18 months ago in a position where we hadn't got nearly enough information to enable us to know how the railways ought really to work. And we spent the first period, very nearly a year altogether, collecting this information and analysing it, costing present-day railway operations and costing future ones that we had in mind as a part of the reshaped pattern. In all our planning, we haven't forgotten that railways are there to serve people and that they're run by people. We haven't forgotten the human side, nor have we forgotten the old British pride in railways. What we intend to do is to strike a balance which will enable each of the forms of transport to do those things which it can do best. And it seems to us that this is the right way to shape the transport system as a whole.
That was the voice of Dr. Richard Beeching. The year is 1963. As the new chairman of British Railways, Dr. Beeching and his team, through their report, The Reshaping of British Railways, had just suggested closing 2,363 stations and scrapping 5,000 miles of railway line. This would equate to the loss of 55% of all stations, 30% of route miles, and the loss of 67,700 British rail jobs. The Beeching Axe, as it became known, would rapidly change life in Britain and in turn Leeds, reshaping the identities of entire communities. But how did we get to this point? How did the railways slowly seep into every aspect of life, only to be scrubbed back out again? For that, let's travel a little bit further back in time. In 1820, a short advertisement appeared in the 26th of February edition of the Leeds Mercury. It marked the beginning of a series of developments that would permanently shape the future city, the country, and the rest of the world. Intended railroad from Leeds to Selby. We are happy to hear that it is in contemplation for erecting a railway from this place to Selby, and that the line of the said road will be inspected in a few days in order to report the practicality thereof. We hope it will be supported by the commercial interests of this town, as well as all the large intermediate towns from hence to Liverpool, and by which the transit of goods will be regular and certain. And supported it was. Original members of the company's board included John Marshall and Benjamin Gott, two titans of Leeds' textile industry. 2 contractors were employed to carry out construction on the line, one responsible for the first 2 miles out of Leeds, and the other carrying on the remaining 18 miles to Selby. It still exists today as the rail route into the city from the east. However, when constructed, this first line terminated at Marsh Lane and continued no further into Leeds. The tunnel under Richmond Hill, which again still just about exists today, used to stretch much further east, almost to where Park Parade is today. This tunnel, covering the final part of the route from Selby to the Line's End at Marsh Lane, would be the world's longest railway tunnel at opening, and the first through which passengers would be hauled by locomotives. 3 ventilation shafts were sunk along its route, and there were early experiments with reflectors placed at their base to reflect light from the surface into the whitewashed tunnels. Despite these efforts, an 1835 report in the Mechanics Magazine, Museum, Register, Journal and Gazette by John Herapath relayed one passenger's less than desirable experience of travelling through the tunnel. We were immediately enveloped in total darkness, and every one of the carriages filled with smoke and steam to a most annoying degree. Though we were but a few minutes going through, such was the nuisance, we thought it to be an hour. Bear in mind, even at its original world record-breaking length, the tunnel was only about 800 yards, or 700 metres. It seems there was a fair amount of scepticism regarding what the report describes as the unnatural burrowing of railway tunnels. Not everyone agreed with George Stephenson's bold, steam-powered vision of the future. And whilst the Leeds and Selby Railway was the first mainline railway to enter the city, it wasn't Leeds' first experience with trains. That honour goes to the Middleton Railway, originally a wooden wagonway constructed in 1758 to transport coal from the rich seams around Middleton to Leeds. It went on to see the first successful commercial use of steam locomotives, changing the entire world in the process. It survives today thanks to the Middleton Railway Trust, and is proudly the world's oldest continuously working railway. I find it utterly fascinating that in the pursuit of selling more coal than the rival Fenton family in Roughwell, who could transport via the river, Charles Brandling and his agent Richard Humble developed something that would have such a profound reverberation around the world. I also feel a completely irrational sense of pride that it happened in Leeds. From the Leeds and Selby Railways opening in 1834, things moved incredibly quickly. Over a century away from their eventual nationalisation in 1948, when British Rail was born, these first decades of the railways saw numerous competing private companies, all building and operating their own routes, often resulting in unnecessary duplication and a lack of standardisation. It wasn't until 1890, for instance, that the entire network was forced to convert to a single standard gauge of track. For those interested, there are no less than 25 different track gauges today, my personal favourite being the Swedish 3-foot, measuring a controversial 2 foot 11 and 3/32 of an inch rail to rail. The Manchester and Leeds Railway and the North Midland Railway opened in 1836 and 39 respectively, sharing the Leeds Hunslet Lane station in what was then an affluent middle-class area. The site is occupied by the Crown Point Retail Park today. Despite the growing number of lines, stations and depots encroaching the centre, it wasn't until 1869 that a radical piece of Leodesian Victorian engineering linked it all together. Running a mile through the centre of Leeds, elevated on a red brick viaduct, it was a joint effort by the London and North Western Railway and the North Eastern Railway, the latter of which had absorbed the original Leeds to Selby company. To accompany this new track was a new station, which joined Wellington Street Station, Central Station, Wellington Station, along with associated goods stations, to become the city centre's 6th station. Called Leeds New Station, this is the one that survives today, straddling the River Aire on top of the famous Dark Arches. And by the turn of the 20th century, Leeds' centre was absolutely covered in rail track. Multiple companies ran competing and overlapping services through a confusing myriad of infrastructure, reflecting the wider country. The First World War saw the government take the railways under state control, which continued until 1921. The seed of the idea of complete nationalisation had firmly been planted. The Railways Act of 1921 saw the country's 120 different railway companies, many of whom were making insane financial losses, consolidated into 4 main companies, each dominating its own geographic area. The Great Western Railway, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, the London and North Eastern Railway, and the Southern Railway. It took another world war to finally push full nationalisation through in 1948. British Railways, known from 1965 as British Rail, was born. From the off, they were conscious of the dense and chaotic network they'd inherited. Some of the lines were already immensely unprofitable and hard to socially justify, and cuts and closures began almost immediately after nationalisation. By 1955, just 7 years after taking control, British Railways reported its first operating loss, a trend which sadly never ceased. A 1954 white paper by the British Transport Committee set out a vast programme of modernisation, aiming to bring the network into the 20th century and promising to eliminate the network's financial deficit by 1962. Frustratingly, the process became widely politicised by the tense fighting between the Labour and Conservatives at the time, and many of the much-needed reforms were implemented in a very half-baked way. Whilst removing steam engines from the network was long overdue, they were replaced by poorly designed diesel units rushed through by British suppliers who had limited experience in building them. This rushed commissioning was due to the expectation of rapid electrification of the network, rendering the diesel units a temporary stopgap. This was wildly misguided. Full electrification of the network still doesn't exist today. By 1961, losses were running at £300,000 a day, and the British Transport Commission could no longer even pay the interest on their loans. And so cue our rather monotone friend Dr. Beeching, a chap who I feel might have bore quite an unfair notoriety, as opposed to people like Buchanan, who were doing a very similar job at almost the exact same time. I suppose Beeching's decisions had a more immediate impact. People witnessed a very sudden change, one that many were unhappy with. British people hate change at the best of times. Can you imagine the wider public's reaction to this announcement? One of the last bastions of the great empire decimated. Buchanan's effects took longer to materialise. And whilst Beeching did a great job in producing statistical data showing how woefully inefficient the network was, like 1/3 of the entire network was carrying just 1% of the traffic, I think where it all went wrong was how the data was used to model for the future. Most of the suggestions for redevelopment were based on 2 maps that had been created, one for passengers and one for freight, where the thickness of the lines represented the volume of the traffic. Whilst visually striking, great PR, and appearing to give a clear answer of what to do, scrap everything with too low a volume of traffic, there was little to no adjustment made for future changes in conditions. That continued exponential population growth and future development of rural areas could begin to significantly increase demand in certain areas in the not-too-distant future. It essentially assumed that all trends around volume would only continue in the direction they were heading when that single snapshot was taken in 1963. On top of this was the general mood of the time, that the car was king, that road transport was the future for everybody. The roads had been muscling in on the railways since the 1920s, and there was an issue in particular that put the railways at an immense disadvantage all the way until 1962, the common carrier requirement. In the 19th century, to prevent rail carriers, who then had a complete monopoly on land transport, from cherry-picking the most profitable freight, the government required all railways to carry any cargo offered to it at a nationally agreed price, often well below that which would be needed for the rail operators to make a profit. And everyone knew what these rates were, so road haulage companies which came along in the 20th century could just undercut them. By the time the requirement was lifted in 1962, it was too late. Along with Beeching's cuts came a massive rebranding exercise. British Railways and its heraldic lion and crown gave way to what has gone on to become a piece of British design history. Led by Milner Gray, The design research unit of the new British Rail created the Corporate Identity Manual, establishing a clear and coherent branding across the network which lives on to this day. Rail blue and pearl grey were chosen as the standard colour scheme for all rolling stock. Rail alphabet was the standard corporate typeface, designed by the legendary Jock Kinnear and Margaret Calvert, the team who gave us motorway signage and created the model for all modern road signage. And most importantly, designed by Gerald Barney, was the new logo. 2 interlocked arrows across 2 parallel lines, white on red. The arrestingly simple double arrow logo to this day remains utterly synonymous with the railway to every single person living in the country. Passenger numbers, however, continued to decline, and by 1970 they were roughly half of what they had been immediately before World War II and nationalisation. As the world rapidly modernised around it, speed became the name of the game. To compete with the motor vehicle's door-to-door abilities, the only way the rail network was to survive was by offering lightning-fast journey times. The problem was that high-speed trains like to run in straight lines, and the ageing British network, particularly the West Coast Main Line, contained far too many curves. As we tried to push the average speed of new diesel and electric trains higher, derailments began to become more common. British Rail knew that something wild and radical needed to be done, and so they set out on the most ambitious engineering project you've probably never heard of, the Advanced Passenger Train. A tilting, high-speed train designed for a maximum speed of 155 miles an hour. The APT, as it was better known, was a PR disaster. By the late 1970s, the project had been under construction for nearly a decade, and the train was still not ready for service. Political pressure from the newly elected Margaret Thatcher panicked British Rail management into putting prototypes into service too early. The result was a media frenzy where every problem, large or small, received front-page coverage. The seeds of privatisation were sown. British Rail and nationalised industry as a whole were being revealed as the disaster the Conservatives had always said it was. The APT project quietly continued, and the trains were reintroduced in 1984 with much greater success, but yet again it was too little too late. The high-speed train, or HST, a much less imaginative conventional diesel engine that had been rapidly developed and tested to plug the gap, had already become the backbone of the network's passenger service. All support for the APT project finally collapsed. And despite the project's failure, the design went on to be highly influential and directly inspired other successful trains like the Pendolino, which tilts and turns along the West Coast Main Line today. But what does this all mean for Leeds? And just before the outbreak of World War II and nationalisation, the new Leeds station built on the Dark Arches and its adjacent Wellington station were combined to form Leeds City Station. The current Queen's Hotel was also built in 1937, replacing its predecessor from 1863, originally built by the Midland Railway. The new London, Midland and Scottish Railway was keen to build a newer, grander building to show off. I almost feel bad that they were dissolved so soon after by nationalisation. In 1962, the unmissable British Railways House, or City House, was built. Designed by disgraced architect John Paulson, it was built to provide administrative space for British Rail. The building has few fans, and poet laureate John Betjeman rightly credits it with blocking all light from City Square and described it as a testament to money with no architectural merit. The dated and impossible-to-let building was redeveloped by Bruntwood and reopened in 2017, named Platform. The facade does look a lot better, but I still feel it looming over me whenever I'm near the station. 1967 also saw some reorganisation. City Station had been split into City North, the old Wellington station, and City South, the new station. From 67, City North, or Wellington, became entirely devoted to parcel traffic, and City South simply became Leeds Station, which is how we know it today. Fascinatingly, the old Wellington or City North station still has remnants existing under Leeds' current station, down in the maze of the Dark Arches. where an elaborate system of tunnels and subways once linked everything together. Electrification finally came to Leeds in 1988, one of British Rail's final acts before privatisation in the 90s. And despite selling off nearly every other state-owned industry during her tenure, the privatisation of British Rail actually fell to the woefully underprepared John Major government, whose unexpected win in 1992 meant they had roughly a year to conjure up a plan before the Railways Bill was due to be published. British Rail pushed for a single private company. John Major favoured a return to something like the Big Four just before nationalisation in the 40s. Sadly, the money-hungry Treasury got their way instead. The creation of first 7, then 25 different passenger railway franchises as a way of maximising revenue, reducing a piece of national infrastructure to something more akin to a burger chain. Despite all this, Leeds Station was actually rebuilt between 1999 and 2002. The beautiful North Concourse, built in 1937, had been, unbelievably, being used as an indoor car park from 1967. It was thankfully restored and today is still the best part about the station. The old metal canopy roof from 1967 covering the main station was replaced with a new glass roof. The footbridge at the back replaced an old subway, 5 new platforms were added, and the majority of track points and signals were replaced, with control of signalling being handed over to York. Something I didn't know until researching this episode is that while this work was carried out, a small temporary station called Leeds Whitehall was built to handle some services. Just off the junction of Water Lane and Springwell Road, you can still make out its ghost on Google Maps. So Leeds' relationship with trains changed dramatically over the 20th century, but rather than a rural area decimated by Beeching's axe, the loss of an enormous amount of its rail infrastructure feels more like an inevitable result of globalisation and the immense decline in the city's heavy industries. I still feel trains are incredibly important to Leeds, though. My first ever journey to the city, like many, many others, was via train. Without the train, Leeds would have been a very inaccessible place for me, and my life would have turned out very differently. Trains quickly became synonymous with my relationship with the city. I commuted via train to work, to gigs, to band practices, back home to my family. They remain a great way of transporting large amounts of people over long distances, and something we should definitely re-embrace en masse to become a more climate-friendly society. Where I feel rail in Leeds has suffered immensely is from privatisation. The station doesn't feel like the problem. The track, although some of the worst in Europe, also doesn't feel like the problem. It's the carriers running the trains. Private companies cannot provide a public service. TransPennine Express and Northern are wonderful examples of that. During 2020, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, all train operating companies entered into emergency recovery measure agreements with the UK and Scottish governments. The franchise game had finally collapsed. Great British Railways is a planned state-owned public body that will both replace Network Rail as infrastructure operator and will also control the contracting of train operations, the setting of fares and timetables, and the collection of fare revenue in most of England. To be clear, the government is insisting this is not renationalisation. Replacing the franchise system with concessions, it wants to alleviate the operator's burden of financial risk related to uncertain revenues. Instead, they will simply be paid to run the services, much like Transport for London's successful London Overground concession is currently run by Arriva. Whether this plan will work, I honestly have no idea. Rail travel needs to be made affordable, yet also efficient enough to tempt people away from driving. And there's an argument to be made that the best way to achieve this might actually be to increase the cost of driving rather than slashing the cost of rail. Which, in terms of climate impact, great, but what does this base raise in cost of living do to lower income households? Coupled with the recent announcement of HS2's planned arrival in Leeds being scrapped, it's difficult to say what the future of the railways might look like in the city. I do know that trains remain a great way of efficiently moving large amounts of people over large distances. I know they remain a potentially much more climate-friendly option than cars. I also think, like all public transport, they offer something we have far too little of in modern life: a shared experience. Public transport is all about sharing, giving up your seat for somebody less able, helping someone identify their stop. I genuinely believe its regular use encourages behaviours that are good for everyone. It encourages you to be a little bit less selfish. As we all search for a new normal in this turbulent time, I implore you to consider making the train a part of yours. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Leeds Echoes. If you enjoyed it, let me know. In the meantime, stay safe, take care, and support public transport.